Thank you to the organizers, first and foremost, of this in-person conference, and for the opportunity to share the first digital museum in the Caribbean. I'm Peggy Groves. I'm known more informally here on island instead of Margaret, and Mark de Revere. My husband, Graham, who's sitting in the back, and I are the founders of the digital version of the Grand Bahama Museum. Launched in 2022, we counted on Mark and the members of his company to bring our vision to life. Graham's father was Wallace Groves, who developed the Grand Bahama Freeport. We're passionate about the island of Grand Bahama and its history, and wanted to capture as much as possible before it was lost. I think that's a key component of what drove the decision to move into this medium. Mark and I hope to give you a sense of the challenges we faced in creating the museum and how we structured it, how we planned for it, and how we plan now for it to grow organically. Though we're not professionals, we were reminded of that last night and during the keynote presentation. We took notes. Yeah, we took notes and thought, do we belong here? But we have to say we've accomplished our goal and we're very proud of it. The journey to relaunch the museum to fully digital format started in 2012. Originally founded in the 1980s by Georgette, my mother-in-law, as a brick and mortar structure at the Garden of the Groves in Freeport. It was a problem because so many hurricanes came through. Jean and Francis where the final took out the final structure, so to speak. When attempts to coordinate with Antiquities, Monuments, and Museums Corporation, University of the Bahamas, and the Grand Bahama Port Authority failed, we made the decision to go digitally because we had control. We knew we could move forward with that. This is a personally funded philanthropic effort, and we've done all the legwork. What we've learned along the way has been immense. I digitized all content. I now know more programs, as does my husband, than when we cared to admit. And most importantly, my husband organized by creating spreadsheets. Anytime you go to a digital content, it's not just telling the developer, Mark, here it is, organize. We had to have the spreadsheets and that categorized and referenced all sources, because you'll see within the museum, we have the ability to touch back and forth.
And that's one of the things that we'll talk about is how we organized. We didn't have your background, so we were just going on being museum patrons as a way to think about all the content that Peggy and Graham collected. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but that was our first challenge, was how do we organize and present? And just to give away a little of the story, we started out pretending we were a brick and mortar museum. That didn't work. Then we went, well, what if we just are a website like normal? That didn't work. And so we came up with an organization system that uses a little bit of what you might expect in a museum. And remember, we were amateurs about this. We didn't know what we were doing at the time, but starts to take advantage of the digital world. So we'll talk on the solution a little bit, but that was a huge challenge for us because Graham and Peggy did collect so much content, which was awesome, but how the heck do you get it out there in a usable form?
And doing the research, I visited many, many sites. Even the Smithsonian has a digital presence. Every museum in the world now has a digital presence, but it is not an entire exhibit. So that is what we confronted and what I handed to Mark. My mission or concept, first let me tell a little bit about my background. I am a pre-med major, biology, chemistry, and later in life I went on and I have a degree in interior design. So a little bit of mix, but both actually helped give me the background to make this work. My mission or concept, as we say in design, which I refuse to let go of or compromise on, I wanted to first and foremost create an accessible source of information for Bahamians, while secondarily serving the tourism industry. Here in the Bahamas, we tend to create museums for the tourism industry, and I thought it was so very important to me to preserve the relevance for the actual people who lived here, especially for students, and I wanted our archive to have a holistic viewpoint, allowing all perspectives or voices to be heard. We're not professional at this, excuse me, turning pages. It all started with Okay, excuse me. We'll work with the microphone a little bit better there. It all started with a 4x6 box of negatives, original images that documented the development of the island from the 1930s onward. We have to remember, on Grand Bahama, as in most of the Bahamas, taking a photo was not as easy as today as clicking that image on an iPhone. It had to do with processing, which wasn't available on island, which usually then was sent over to the States and come back, a very expensive procedure. So the original images that document the development of the island from the 1930s formed the basis or the impetus to get this started. I discovered them in several dozen disorganized boxes that I was determined to organize. I felt a burden. I really felt it was my responsibility because I knew that others would look at this box of just thrown together things and say, this is trash, out. And also my age was pressing upon me because I have children, grandchildren, again, who would have that motivation to do so. Throughout the process, I spoke and I met with anyone who would listen to me, email communications. I was diligent and dogged about pursuing professors, historians, elders, radio hosts to discover the accepted principles and methods of recording history in archiving. How did I archive? What was how do you do it? How do you reference it? The original sources of material that I had. I constantly pulled on threads. Mark gave me that analogy because I never stopped. One conversation, an article, a source, one thing added to the other. This has been a long project, lots of material. While trying to source the history of Grand Bahama, I found James Baker, a historian who visited Grand Bahama for many years. He lived at Plymouth, but he was a historian at Plymouth Plantation in Massachusetts. He had researched and sourced all documents for the most complete history of the on-island. Years of exchanged communication, years, and personal visits and emails back and forth resulted in permission to use his research and his sources. His contribution, formatted to be consumed in the digital platforms that we used, formed the basis of the history for the sections of Grand Bahama and the Grand Bahama Port Authority.
And so that's really the second challenge was just, I have to talk to the microphone. I learn. That was really the big second challenge was finding people that would lead us to people that would lead us to people that would have the actual source content. And Peggy and Graham were able to get to people and record, in some cases, their stories of if the person was 80 years old when they were a child, that would have been lost otherwise because there was no written or document or pictures of what was going on. And that's hard to get to, right? And then there were people that had content, and we had to really get through that. We don't want your physical content. We want you to give us permission to use it, and you keep the physical content. And that's different than when somebody says, oh, it's a museum, they want to take something from me. So that was another part of that challenge. So Peggy pulled at so many threads to find so many people, and actually this conference is another thread, right? Because somebody sitting out here, I told Peggy, is going to be able to help us grow. So that's how Peggy did it, just reaching out.
And I'm not done yet. So what I initially focused on was touch my picture, hear my story. It was very, very important to me to present holistically, to allow others in the past to have a voice. And the keynote speakers spoke of this last night, how we have to allow people to own their history. And so we did this through the touch my picture, hear my story, where the voices of the early pioneers on island would tell their stories. My husband, Graham, and I knew that this was elders were passing that were within our circle, so to speak, or within our knowledge. And so we began recording conversations over dinner parties. We learned we aren't great interviewers because conversations would evolve in the directions that were not necessarily we wanted to include. But we conducted these interviews over the years, but now everyone is gone. All these people that we spoke of, that we knew, that we wanted the information of on how the island developed and how things were in the past. Then David Wallace, who did a radio program, Pearls of Grand Bahama. I contacted him, again, pulling that thread. He got back to me, back and forth. He found his recordings that he had done in the 1990s, perhaps, with elders on Grand Bahama. this contributed to this section that Mark has up now, Hear My Story. What was so difficult here is I wanted pictures. How do we visualize the voice that we had? We had the voices that were not even on DVDs. I don't know the format, but it went from CDs to Graham finding a program that we had to get an external drive. And so again, credit my husband for being diligent. And the photography that we had was an old calendar, which was produced as part of this series. The photos were so faded and so old. No one else had sources. I tried to contact family members, nothing. Hurricanes had wiped out what they had on island. So what I did is I took the old images, and forgive my art, I did quick hatch drawings, again, my design background, quick hatch drawings that would give a likeness. And I think I've captured close to their likeness. So forgive me for any inaccuracies. But this is the thing. We have to realize how fragile our history is here on island. It's gone. It's wiped out with a hurricane. It's wiped with the passing of that elder generation. And we would have missed that. It gives us a perspective. It anchors us. Because, as you see even here on New Providence, we've moved on. There's concrete patching over what the beaches people used to walk, and the paths through the trails through the pine forest are gone. But these people remember. And that's what's so interesting with Touch My Picture, Hear My Story.
Nope, keep going.
Keep going, okay. The source of lives lived is another very important discovery. Within those boxes, I found old steno spiral notebooks that someone had actually recorded the oral history of persons. And through that, the interviews contributed to allowing the story to be told to even more voices of the past. These were handwritten notes. They contain information of the wages of workers. It has grocery lists, what came in on the mailboat. That's history. And that tells the culture that was on island in the 1930s, 1940s, and that's been lost. And if not these steno notebooks, which again are just pieces of paper, old, falling apart, it was very important for me to reclaim that. One of the other stories I have, I came here on many years ago, went to the NASA library here, which was part of the museum system. Went up to the third floor, I believe, and it was just old, perhaps had meant to be a display up there, but I wandered through the maze of collected items, and I discovered 2 old framed plating samplers. And I had to ask someone this morning, we in the Midwest say it plating, you all say plating. So I noticed on the site we have to make sure that we maintain historically correct nomenclature. So maneuvering, I found photos that began my search for persons who could possibly demonstrate to me these historical plating patterns. It is supposedly there were 60 patterns that existed in the past, but many have been lost with the passing of elder generations. I've had Pam Burnside contact me. Where did I find these? So she's someone that's important here on island and involved in the preservation of history. Another section, philatelic history. This is huge out there in the world. People travel to collect stamps. The value of stamps is tremendous. A penny black, you find one of those, you're lucky. That's your good day. It's not finding that penny, it's finding that postage stamp. They provide a fascinating and colorful window into the history of the Bahamas. The rule of a nation, from British colony to independence, to the politics, to geography, bush medicine, history of the disasters that have happened here can be followed through the artistic representations of these small pieces of gum paper. Pirates, governors, prime ministers are honored. Images of stamps are used as illustrations throughout the site. Where we couldn't find, say, an image of a certain plant within our bush medicine section, guess what? There's a stamp of that item. So that took me on another, we'll wait for that. Let me follow my notes here.
Well, let me jump in here.
Yes, please.
So that was another challenge for us is Peggy spent, I don't know how many hours scanning the stamps in so that we could use them on the site. And we used them with the permission of
the Postmaster General, which took me first to copyright law here in the Bahamas, speaking to attorneys, and where permission may exist and how to source it, and then went to directly to Postmaster General, which gave permission for their use. Since we don't have commercial gain here, the site is entirely available to anyone worldwide on all platforms, whether it is the computer, your iPhone, iPad.
And that's part of the reason it's constructed the way it is that when Peggy and Graham went and talked with people, their content isn't being used to make us money or somebody else money. It's really about being able to present it to whoever wants to come explore the history of Grand Bahama. Now, so that one challenge was getting permission, but the second challenge was for my team, the technical team, and how do we use these stamps and how do we present them? So it's very easy to do, hey, let's show all the stamps in time periods. That's okay, and if you're a stamp person, maybe that's exciting to you. But for the rest of us, okay. So one concept we had, or Peggy had, was, and remember, we're not you. We wanted to get something launched because having the website launched, it had to be good, maybe not great, but it had to be good in the beginning so that we could spread the word and dig up more people that could contribute. So we plowed ahead, and we never really solved the stamp problem, what we call the stamp problem. They're liberally used throughout the site, but we came up with a concept after we launched last year, which is we are constructing for release this year another section of the museum that will be the history of the museum chronologically, with certain stamps telling the story as we go, and there are very few gaps. The stamps cover an awful lot. And then each stamp will be an entryway into material about that era or that year or that concept. So it'll be a chronological history of Grand Bahama using the stamps, but you'll be able to drill into it and explore more about what's in that particular era. Which leads to when we got away from the concept of a traditional brick and mortar museum to a digital museum is, hey, as we all know, the beauty is you can use content, the same content in many different displays, as opposed to having a physical piece where it can only be in one place at one time. So when that dawned on us and we were able to do that, you'll see throughout the site that there is a stamp that might be in a natural history section. It may also be in a maritime section. It's obviously in the stamp section, and maybe that stamp is going to represent a certain time on the chronological exhibit that we're creating. So for us, that was a little bit of a aha moment. For some of you, it may just be a regular Tuesday. You woke up and you know that, but we didn't know it. So that challenge for us wasn't solved before we launched, but we didn't want to wait for everything under the sun to be ready before we launched.
It's growing. It hasn't ended here. And I think one of the things that the philatelic history of the Bahamas brought to the forefront is I can do the Museum Antiquities, Monuments and Antiquities has said, I think Mr. Prime Minister Christie had said, he wanted a museum on every island because every island is culturally a little bit different. The history is a little bit different. But I have to also say Grand Bahama is part of the Bahamas. And culturally, there is so much overlap, just like the stamps tell the history really of the Bahamas, not just Grand Bahama. Though there's a history there, we have the crown circle that was stamped, that actually there was a post office in the 1940s at Pine Ridge. So it tells so many stories. One of my favorite is, did you know that the Bahamas actually had an underwater post office? Believe it or not. It was considered a scientific expedition at the time because underwater photography had just been developed and it took place in the photosphere. So what happened is they had the post office on the ground floor. They have a stamp representing that, on underwater floor. And then they have the postage stamp that shows the photosphere. The history of the Bahamas could almost be told in stamps. We've covered that. But we want you to understand that we are excited about continuing to explore advantages of digital. I'll hand it to Mark. And by the way, I have to say, we have been speaking via Zoom for 9 years. This is the first time I have met him. So things can be done. He's taller than I thought.
The pandemic got in the way a little bit, right? For all of us. How many of you here actually are working on a digital museum? Either have an extension of your physical museum or are contemplating working on a digital museum? A couple of you. Okay. I see you taking notes over there, so maybe I'm talking to you. So there are some challenges from my team side, which we're still trying to solve. One of which is there's a lot of great content, but in order to make it really usable, you have to have large size files, which means that if you've got a bad internet connection, the museum stinks for you, right? So we created a middle road of, as you can see with this stamp, you could look at it at a larger size, get the detail and understand it, but it doesn't take a minute to load on your computer and you're gone. That's one big challenge for us, and we continue to refine what we're doing there. And if any of you are interested in that, I'll talk to you about it afterwards. If you just come up to me and I can explain what's going on there. But that is a big challenge because I sit fat, dumb, and happy in the United States in Atlanta, and everybody's got fast internet. You just don't worry about it. But that's not the real world when you get out into some parts of the United States and when you come here in some parts. It's just not right. So if we're really going to be honest about we want it to be equity of access here, then we've got to be able to solve that problem. So we know, again, we wanted to get out there. We know that it's not perfect in that regard, but that's one of the things that we continue on the technical side to work on. So that's a challenge that those of you that are doing this will face.
And then, Mark, talk a little bit about hacking. In today's world, we confront these issues. So this site is really protected and updated.
Yeah, and that's for anybody that's doing it, that's a key thing because that's a constant battle for those of us that run and maintain websites is keeping the bad guys out because they're always trying to get in, and that's really that'll hurt your brand, if you will. Very badly, and people won't come back to your site because they've had a bad experience there. You've got to stay away from that. So that's something we've spent quite a bit of time on. The other thing, another challenge for you is, okay, somebody's coming to your site, and a lot of times the person that we had in mind, my team had in mind, was a high school student doing research, okay? And they get to the site, how are they finding what they're looking for? So we've built and are expanding a search mechanism that's based on a number of factors. One of which is every piece of content in the site is tagged. You might have a fancy word for it. We call it tagged, which is just a series of words that we've created a structure around so that we can easily, even in the search, if it doesn't match it, we know it's close enough and we'll go find that tag and bring you back content. So I searched for 1938. And it brings up all the different types of things that were tagged with 1938. Touch my picture, hear my story, which is our favorite. Different displays, and then the stamps. And then there are pure photos, and then publications and documents. So somebody, again, a high school student doing a paper, come in, and in theory, they might find what they're looking for. So that's one way we did it, by this extensive tagging process, which took a long time, and it was not exactly the most fun thing to do.
And I credit my husband for developing spreadsheets that then went to Mark with all the content, and again, tagging was just days and days process.
And now it's easy because when a new piece of content comes in, there's a structure for it, and we may create new tags. And then in a couple of cases, we've gone back and re-tagged others because it's a subject that we want to group under. But that's a challenge, and you can't just leave it up to generalized search, which we have that as well under the covers. But the specifics really help us say, okay, generalized search gets this result. Let's go get everything else. This tag. Let's go get everything else for that tag as well. So that is a challenge that anybody that's already got a digital version of what you are showing and want people to search and find things, that's always a challenge.
What I'm very proud of, and Mark as well, is that it's not just static. It's not just not scrolling through. Here's an example I found. eBay had been wonderful in the early days of eBay. I collected. Here's that underwater post office, which I have the original text of. It's not just static, and it's not just searching for photos. You can search voice, and you can search, for example, through New at the Museum, which is our continually updated section. We introduce and expand topics. For example, I have one where I had someone narrate. I have a book that published in 1795 that documents through the American Folklore Society out of Baltimore, documents all of the folktale of the time. So we have someone narrating Barabi, Baspider, and Babuki. I had to look up who Babuki was. I knew the other ones, who they were, but Babuki is the goat. So we have someone narrating that entire folktale. My other one, new at the museum, is Winslow Homer. We have his art and permission. Well, now it is out of copyright, so we're able to represent Winslow Homer. He was one of the original artists that brought the beauty of the Bahamas to the world. It was before color photography, so here is Mr. Homer, who produced these gorgeous paintings that were then in turn used in illustrations, and that is how he gained his notoriety. He was actually pen and ink drawings went into the original publications of such, I think it was Century Magazine, that documented the health benefits of coming to Nassau in the time, the 1930s, of being in the warm weather for those who were ill during the winter.
Okay.
Now.
So we get to the point where we are ready to launch the site. And we launched it last year, which was great. It's a great fanfare between the three of us. And then it was, what's next? Well, we knew that we wanted to continue to add content on a regular basis. We knew that there was a whole host of content that we didn't use when we launched. It didn't fit in somewhere. We weren't really ready to pull the threads to get the permissions and supporting documentation that would go with it. So we took a pause. We ironed out some bugs, which you always do when you have a site that you launch. And then Peggy took some time to get some social media going as a way of starting to create interaction with people that visit the site. So Instagram and Facebook are the two properties that she's been working on and posting to regularly. And what's neat about it is, that was New in the Museum, the wrong way. And I read through them all, and I was going to have one picked out. But there are people that comment in the Facebook, and there's conversation about it, and Peggy's now got a couple new names from people that said, oh yeah, my family did X, Y, and Z. And so there's another thread to pull. So I don't know that we knew that that would happen with the social media, but we're very happy that it did, and we want to continue to expand and promote there. And the key, as you all know, that do social media, there has to be some sort of regular content going out there. We have all scads of content, so that really is too hard for us because Peggy picks something of interest and posts it and links it back to the museum, which brings us up to the next challenge, and one that we have not yet resolved, which is once you get away from a museum being in a silo, being contained in its four walls, what we would really love to do is to link to other places that it makes sense to link to. So in some cases, it's to a source document, and we've got some examples of that out there. Some cases, it's to another website that has more information about something. We're not proprietary. If you wrote a better write-up about the undersea post office, great. We'll include that in our description, and we've got a bunch of those in the museum. The other place is we were trying to, Peggy, more than me, talking with other museums and organizations about supporting each other and providing links into us and out to them so that the visitors to our site, let's be a little selfish here, can have an even broader exposure to whatever topics that they're interested in. And we're hoping that there are people that will come and don't know that they had interest in the subject until they came across it in the museum, and then can go explore. Yeah, everybody can go to Google and search, but we would like to, I don't know if I'm using the word correctly, guide them into quality and reputable and sourced places that will broaden their knowledge and whatever they're enthusiastic for, keep that enthusiasm going. So that's a challenge for us right now, because a lot of people are like, I'm busy, I'm doing my own thing, see ya. And other people are, well, we got permissions and we have to go through this, and there's this committee and there's that committee. So right now we sit with that as a challenge that we haven't solved and we're working on, but we're hoping that as more of you and other organizations go into the digital format and you want to do the same thing, that will be something that we'll be able to add more into the website.
And what I thought was important to be launched is to make us real, to show that this was so awesome, and the volume of material that we have, that such entities such as museum monuments, antiquities monuments, would like to put their logo on our site, which we would then link to them, they link to us. Or the Bahamas Trust, again, back and forth. The University of the Bahamas. But I've yet to accomplish that. I think there is within the museum, especially with the tourism aspect of museums in the Bahamas, there's a protectiveness that perhaps that I'd want to take something from them. And I'm going, no, I want to give to you all. And by linking to me, for example, we were speaking about bush medicine this morning, and I was saying, but the tour guides give a lecture on bush medicine, for example, but what they say is wrong. And the keynote speakers last night were speaking about this, how they needed to educate those who are giving the tourists tours. I've had Dr. Livingston actually donate his entire book. He has a PhD. He's written of bush medicine. And within the links of the museum and our text, which he wrote and donated, which is recognized, he has links to the elders that granted him the knowledge. Every recipe that he collected has the need for a rusty nail within the remedy. He says, as a scientist, I want to know what that rusty nail did. But unfortunately, the elders are gone now, and there's no one to ask. And that's the beauty of he has captured on video a number of those elders giving their recipes and explaining the bushes and giving an actual tour. But that's so valuable. But again, it makes you realize how fragile the history is here in the Bahamas, because so much of it is based on oral history. We don't have museums that have, or we do. We have a reproduction of a duo, a Lucayan duo that my mother-in-law luckily borrowed and reproduced. And but we don't have the items to touch and see that we would like to have. But we have images and we have voices, and I think the voices are what's so important and give us legitimacy. And my insistence at the beginning of this project, which I will continue, is that we make this as accessible as we can, that has all voices and represents the people of the Bahamas first and foremost, and gives them access to their culture, their history. And I hope you all see we're not done yet. We're still growing, we're still looking for sources, and that's what the digital format gives us. And then back to the postings, I happened upon the theme, 50 Years, 50 Voices, and that's launched on Facebook. So that then links back to Live Lived and Touch My Picture, Hear My Story. And we've generated quite a bit of interest.
Yes, so 2 challenges that Peggy just touched on. One is in the Lives Lived section, which we really want to expand, but there isn't a lot of research and writing for people that weren't in the newspaper, let's put it that way, in the 40s, 50s, 60s on Grand Bahama. So we are going after the oral histories and, yes, going after the oral history. And that's another challenge, is time now, right? It took us a good 10 years to do all of this because we didn't know what we were doing in the beginning at all. And now it's a race against time because it's all going to go away because so much of it is oral. And that's probably probably the pressure that Peggy feels the most at this point in being the person that's going after all of that. That's one challenge. The second challenge really is the idea of when she did the 50 years project and putting content out for that is relevancy of content. So it's okay just to post something that's of interest, cool looking stamp, a cool looking story, but it's even better if you can tie it to something that people are experiencing in the world, and it's a natural time to come to the museum and find information. And we hope when they do, because they're interested in the topic that is relevant in their circle at that point in time, whatever that is, that they'll want to explore other information at the museum.
And the other thing that's also been so important is the people I've met, the relationships that I've built. One of the ones who you may have heard of is Eric Weiberg. He's well known here on Grand Bahama because he speaks regularly at the Bahama Historical Society. He contributed his whole history of mail boats. If you've lived on an island, you realize how important they are culturally, what they've done. I mean, they provide the interconnectivity to this entire nation. So that was another huge portion of research, which my relationship with Mr. Weiberg helped take off. And the relationship with Mark, who I've met through conversations. Just as I said, one thing led to the other, and that's what's so important in the digital world is the relationships you form and how you reach out, whether it's via Zoom and our development, or conversations or email.
Now, okay. So a couple things. One is, we had a lot of fun along the way. I know it's not showing today, but yeah, we did. We laugh a lot. Because it's fun to do this too, right? The second thing is, whenever Peggy or Graham or myself are talking to people, if there's anybody here that even knows one story or knows somebody that knows a story or knows somebody that knows somebody that knows a story, find us, because we want that. So we're hoping that somebody here would have that. And we make no claims to be in your world. We've just plowed ahead and gotten to where we've gotten. And if any of you are in the position like, hey, let's have a conversation, maybe I can help you, or maybe you can help us, we're always willing to do that. So that's something that, whether it's on the finding things side, the organizing side, or on the technical side, we've got you covered, and don't be afraid to reach out. We would sorely like to help other people not make the same mistakes that we've made to this point, and to be able to get their stories, their collections out there to the world as well.
We think we've developed a phenomenal site. If you take the time to scroll through, we've only shown you just a very, very small portion. I've had inquiries from researchers that have found us. They wanted to know where I found the image of a Lucayan Indian skull. Well, in my box of dusty things, I have a book from 1905 that researched from, again, Baltimore, that came down, expeditions into the Bahamas, and they had that image of an original 1905 Lucayan Indian skull. And researchers have then contacted me, asked me for permission. I said, the book's out of print. Go ahead and publish. I've had inquiries even from the National Geographic production. Lucayan Indian remains were discovered in Ben's Cave on Grand Bahama, and they asked for permission to use those images in their production, which came out this past December. So again, relationships. It's amazing how the internet has connected us to sources, and we want more of that. So we keep pulling on threads. I rely on Mark to weave them in, and I hope you visit and explore the entire content of the museum because we are very proud of it. And we'd like to entertain questions now and have a discussion. Thank you.
I am so happy I stayed in this section.
We are too.
I am Andrea Major, the president of the Bahamas Historical Society. I've spoken with you.
Nice to meet you.
Yes, and I've turned you on occasion to Jim Lawler. Yes, and he's a first vice president. So I'm very happy to be here today. You've given me much food for, thought. And of course, today I closed the museum because I'm in this conference. Many volunteers have not come back since the COVID. So I was in there basically by myself for a year and a half. So sometimes if you called, I was like, okay, I'm going to speak to Peggy, but she will know how it is. So I'm really happy to meet you, and I'll spend a little more time with you, hopefully before we depart from the conference. So thank you for all that information. Many of the things you talked about, we have stamps, I'm a stamp collector. So I told them we're going to do a stamp collection. And then, of course, you have Mr. Hardy, who's been making so many pen things and everything from the trees. So that might be a good link for you. And of course, many of the things you talked about are in what I used to call the Bible for the Bahamas Handbook. Oh, in depth. So thank you so much for this. I will definitely be looking in your site as soon as I have some time. I'll make time. But really, it's wonderful to have your presentation this morning. I'm very happy I stayed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I feel really close now. Hi, my name is Catherine Smith. I'm in tech. I'm a developer, and I'm actually here with an organization called the Experience, which is building out something similar around the Atlantic slave trade around the world. And so I think this is amazing. This is it.
I want to link to you.
Okay. Yeah, this is amazing. And so I'm thinking about transferring a physical space to an experience. Is this cutting out? Can you hear me? Okay. Thinking about transferring a physical space to an online experience, I think it's different. So walking through a physical space is definitely a different experience from being online. And the ways that people kind of discover information is different. Can you speak about how you developed a user experience for the website versus the physical space?
Yes. Yeah, so we went through a number of iterations of design and user experience for the website. And the first few were awful. You might find the story interesting, but other people wouldn't. So I'll talk to you about this afterwards. But the bottom line was we started working with a wonderfully creative artist, a young woman who now lives in Costa Rica, who came up with a design that you see, and she understands user experience, and she was able to take Peggy's words of, I don't want it to look like the Met's website or the British Museum's website. I want it to be a Grand Bahama website, and I don't want it to be a bunch of squares. Let's see what you can do. And she heard that and understood it, and she understands user experience. And so when she came back with her design, and I am going to tell you that the developers that did this, if I can talk to you for a second about that, it was extremely hard to do this design and make it responsive. Responsive meaning you can resize the screen and look at it on your phone or on a huge screen. But she was insistent, and she is so good, you always do what she says, Rachel. And so it became something that was more friendly, and we could present, if I go look at exhibits, something that, it's not exactly slick here, something like this, which could have just been a bunch of square boxes and don't tell a story, and your old's eyes glaze over, into something that is a better user experience. So the short answer is we tried to replicate what the rest of the world was doing, and it didn't work. And it had to be somebody that, in this case, had visited museum sites, digital sites, but was going to listen to what Peggy was really saying and come up with a way to help guide people through the site. So and I have a web development, software development firm. There is no substitute for a good designer, both on the user interface, and Rachel happens to be great at that. So that's the real answer to your question. There wasn't, some other discipline that came into play, or another site that we talked to their designer. It was literally Rachel listening to Peggy's words and being able to get that vision out into digital form. The second part of it had to do with Graham's help, making sure that everything was organized and understandable so that we could create a search pattern that would bring things up and tag things, as I mentioned. That's the other part of the user experience is, yeah, we want to guide you through, and if somebody comes in and just starts clicking on the links one right after the other, great. You'll have a good experience and you'll learn a lot, but that's not really how people consume sites like this. It's, oh, that's interesting, let me click on that. The last part is we do want to tie back to physical. So it's a replacement for a physical museum. There's no doubt about that. But there is often no substitute to being in the same place and actually getting the 3D view, which is something else we're going to work on, in real life of items. We were talking last night at dinner about Peggy's grandchildren actually going to see the Constitution. And they were like, yeah, whatever. But the adults were like, wow, this is cool. That's the actual document. So we've all seen pictures of it in the United States, but it's different. You get the chills when you actually see it and you see the parchment or wherever it was written on. So anyway, we want to tie back to the physical space wherever we can. And that's part of our outreach to some of you and others like you that, hey, we've got this exhibit, we're mentioning this, we'll tie back to you because we want people to come see it.
And then having done a physical museum or been part of a physical museum and putting on my interior designer hat, this all translates almost like snap of a fingers into a physical space because guess what? It's digitized. I want to make a wallpaper, say, of this one picture. It like that, I have a piece of wallpaper that has the image blown up to that size. So all of this effort is not just, it is a museum, but it allows us to preserve, archive, and access all that's here. So that's the other wonderful thing. And I want to say, too, we're not done yet, as you keep hearing. Do you have a question?
I kind of want to ask the million-dollar question.
Go for it.
Kind of a pun there, no pun. But I actually I would like to have an idea of implementation costs for this type of project.
Well, if my business partner were here, he wouldn't like my answer. So on Peggy's side, and she'll answer if there's a dollars, this has been her work. This is what she's done for the past decade. Yes, she ran her interior design business, and she had a family and COVID and storms, on the island. But it was, often a full-time endeavor for her to do it. So there's that cost, and I'm sure you spent actual dollars in doing it.
To be honest, I would say we're probably about $60,000 into this process. Now, that being said, the amount of time that Mark has put, as he said, his business partner would not like him for me to, I can't break it down, but I'd say approximately $60,000 up to this point. But the beauty of this was, so to speak, is that both my husband and I had the enthusiasm, the background, the knowledge that came with the interior design, the business aspect, the knowledge of these programs, or the ability to learn and communicate, that really you can't put a dollar sign on. If we were employing people, it would just be phenomenal, the cost.
Yeah, so if you were to come to me and say, Mark, help me build my digital museum, first of all, I'd say yes. And secondly, a project like this is probably a $100,000 project from my point of view. With the amount of time spent, you might look at it and say, oh, that's a website design. But as I've already talked about too much, there was the organization and the missteps in the beginning to getting to that point. And a good designer is not cheap. One of the reasons that my business partner isn't happy with me about this project is we bought into the vision and we wanted to see this succeed. It wasn't a story from one person's perspective. It wasn't slap something together so I can say I have a museum. It was a heartfelt attempt to capture the history of Grand Bahama and have a basis to get the information out there so that other people's stories could be captured as well that would be lost. And because of what Rachel the designer did and Peggy's insistence, it's really accessible to anybody that can get on a device. Crappy Android phone with a slower connection, you can still visit the site. If you have a high-end Mac and want to see everything in all its glory, you can still visit the site and everybody in between. And that was important to us. Trust me, I have clients that would not pay a dime to have that happen. They wouldn't care. They just want to create a brand. That's not what this project's about. And so that is the long-winded answer of how much it costs us to do it.
And I think enthusiasm. Between the designer, Mark, is what, please, I'm willing to hand this over to you.
We have time, so don't feel like you can't finish your answer before we take another question.
I'm closer, we don't lose that.
Okay, thank you very much. Kenny Atai from Trinidad and Tobago. I think this is my first visit to the conference, but I think I picked the right session because we just, as a private enterprise, we got started on creating the Trinidad and Tobago Carnival Museum. This has something been in the making for many, many years, but we just decided, look, let's get some partners together and get it going. So we got it off the ground last year, the brick and mortar version. The next step is the digitization, as you refer to it, thing there. And I'm in the process for someone who already went through the process and had the headaches. We don't intend to reinvent the wheel, but to make the wheel spin faster. So I'm quite happy to listen to your presentation. Very interesting. A couple questions. What was the interest like from the younger generation based on what you have put out so far? And two, we are looking at doing AR, something immersive. Would you think that this will be a precursor to that as a lead up, and how easy it will be to transit from this type of digitization into the AR type experience?
Great questions, and let's make sure we talk after. Okay, so to the young lady that asked the $1 million question, yeah, we're going to do that, but there's a real expense to doing something like an AR immersion. That's not something that, is going to be done easily or for free.
We actually have a costing for a kind of a virtual reality thing I'm from the Burlesque Museum, sorry everybody. So it's supposed to include the museum, historic Bridgetown, its garrison, Newman enslaved burial ground, 6 sites in all, but it's currently costed at $750,000 Barbados dollars just for that, nothing to do with our website.
I believe it. So that's in our future, but not right now, not on our pocketbooks at the moment. And that's something that Peggy is discussing too, is getting outside funding for the effort. Now that we have it, it's concrete, it's not just an idea. It's not concrete at all, is it? That would be something that we would do. Now, we are going to work toward that. So I think I mentioned earlier, some 3D views of things. That is something that we can do. My suggestion to you is make sure you have a professional photographer taking pictures if you're going to take pictures. In a lot of cases, we discovered pictures and used the originals, but if you're going to do that, it's worth whatever you would pay a really good photographer to do that. Okay?
And what about the first question with the younger generation?
Okay. What this site, the younger generation, what this site has allowed me to do, I've been invited to schools on Grand Bahama. And the teacher sat there. I would direct her to go to maps. So let's just choose culture here. I'm not good on I'm mouse bound. Go to culture. Thank you. And from culture, then I would explain and explore. Kids loved it because we were jumping around and I was moving. I just had a few bullet points because I'm much better with bullet points than following a script that I feel as if I have to read. But art, music, sponging, plaiting, and we have it misspelled there, in foodways, Junkanoo. It all was just within this page, and the instructor was able to bounce around, click on links. For example, one of these things, the folk dances of the Bahamas. They exist. There are a few sources here in the Bahamas that will talk about folk dances and how they were performed and the history of them. But I found a 1992 master thesis video from that a Bahamian did. I tried to find him, but it was already online, so we used it, that showed visually, visual recordings of every single dance was staged, of how the traditional dances of the Bahamas were done. So sources are out there, but you have to really look. I've had Eric Weiberg, who is, again, become a very, very good friend, my mailboat expert. He has, a young woman came to me through a teacher that was researching an incident that happened here in the Bahamas. I don't know if it was the Flamingo incident, but she needed more resources. So he came to me. I, in turn, had someone for her to contact. So it's the connectivity. Kids love that. If they have a place to go, I have info@grandbahama.org. Email me. I answer. I'm pretty attentive because my enthusiasm has carried over, and the kids that interact with me have been very, very receptive to it. And again, dinner last night, every child in that restaurant last night had an iPhone in his hands and was scrolling the internet. So we need to reach out, but establish the relevance. And that's what allows us through this medium, they don't have to come to me, come to a brick and mortar and be bored. We can offer them how they consume it. We can click here, click there, show them the link. And it is that quick visualization. You have somebody's attention for, 3 seconds, 5 seconds at the most? And that's what this format allows, is for someone to quickly find what they're interested in.
Yeah, so to tie it back to the second question, yes, as we get into more of the immersive technologies, that'll really meet where those kids are living, and it will probably get more attention than we do right now with younger people.
Related to that? If you want to ask it, Mark, if you just repeat
Yeah, I'll repeat it.
Mark, into the mic, though.
Okay,
Thank you.
it's follow-up question related to that, so actually 2 accessibility questions. So related to that question, if kids are like finding this because they're doing research on a specific project, like how well does it support question-based searching? So what was the, like if they said, who was the first person to do this
No.
or whatever?
So,
Can I ask the second accessibility question? And so for a visual experience, like from an accessibility standpoint, like how do you create a non-visual experience based on a very visual kind of platform?
okay, so you're making me remember 2 questions here.
Just accessibility generally.
Yes, so the search, we are going to expand and do some, everybody knows about it now, some AI, natural language query type stuff. Right now, it doesn't. And that was a matter of we wanted to get it launched, we wanted to categorize, organize. But that is on our drawing board at this point. So, yeah, unfortunately, if a child's coming in and your question had to do, can they do what's really a natural language query? Yeah, we might hit on some keywords there that match tags and bring something back, but not at the level that you're asking. But that's in the future, okay? The second part is, yeah, under the covers, we constructed it to be accessible. We did a halfway decent job. Given a bigger budget and more time, it would be perfect. But that's also something that we're very aware of. And in terms of accessibility for people that can't consume the museum visually, yeah, it's okay. it will be better. And the other thing was, in using the colors that we used on the site, there is a little bit of sacrifice on the accessibility side that we are struggling with how to overcome. So that's something that we're working on. So the question really had to do with accessibility, and I'd say I would give us a good B on that right now, but we're very aware of it and moving toward. We're hoping that it would be a natural progression for somebody to be able to come in and consume all the content non-visually. And we would like to get more audio on there as well, because that's a great way to do that.
And speaking of that, one of the issues we confronted is we had those original recordings, and those we actually recorded ourselves. The accent, the Bahamian language, we used a program, Graham used a program called Otter. It couldn't handle a Bahamian accent. So in order the Otter program allows you to transcribe from the audio version to script. Could not handle Bahamian. So we had to do it all manually. So listen to keynotes. And that's another thing we will probably over. Because again, that's part of your culture, which we want to represent. But the programs that exist out there for us to use to assist us is just a tough thing. And that's why we also used, we're showing transcript. Because again, do people really, when I first come here sometimes on Grand Bahama, the accents, I have to tune my ear back to understand. And that was a thing that we had to confront as well.
And that was something that my team was insisted upon, getting these transcripts for people to be able to consume that couldn't consume the touch of my picture, hear my story any other way. What else? If you ask it, I'll repeat it this time.
How have you planned for the sustainability of this project, since you are basically the only two people who are working with this?
So the question was, how do you plan for the sustainability of the project, since we're the only two people working on it, which, by the way, is not true. And because it's being recorded, I have to say this now. My team in particular, Rachel, lead developer Zach, who happens to be Rachel's husband, Will, and some other people that worked on this, there was a team behind it that did a lot of work on this site. So I'm representing them on the technical side, and I'll let Peggy talk about the other side.
We're very cognizant of time. My husband and I were 67, soon to be 68, and I felt if I didn't do this now, it wasn't going to happen. But at the very beginning, we arranged for licensing by government, which was another journey of the Grand Bahama Historical Society. We would hope and would love to plan for those on island to launch the society with the idea that then membership would grow and help sustain this effort. Right now, the cost of maintaining the site is not outrageous. Mark has been very generous to us, just because of my enthusiasm has pulled it out of him. and we continue in a great relationship. But yes, that's a concern of ours. And that also is why we would love to work with the Museum Monuments and Antiquities. We'd like to work with those entities that exist here in the Bahamas to help us continue with this process. To date, we've not been really successful in it, but if anyone here has a connection who will speak to me, I would love to communicate my enthusiasm for this project as well. So again, we're working on that, still trying to find our way of how we guarantee that this survives us. And that was the whole point. My role right now was to preserve what I had. Easily this, and how fragile some of these documents are. We have original copies of the 1955 Hawksbill Creek Agreement that the government doesn't have, that the Port Authority doesn't have. We have original 1795 books that I'm not certain if the Historical Society here in New Providence has. So these collections need to be placed. Florida International University was very interested in requesting the donation of our entire collection. This was after first offering it to the entities here in Nassau. We really considered donating that because, again, when we're gone, my children will not look at these boxes and these documents that have been preserved digitally, but they'll look at the originals going, what am I going to do, keep them in my basement? So we're looking for a home with those, that where they'll be guarded. But I'm concerned here, even in New Providence, if Dorian comes through here, your archives, I hate to say it, are at risk. Where do we put it? That is a good question. We're still searching, and I thought the best answer was digitization, which will always be there. But who will continue to maintain this site? Who will continue to expand and grow? Because that's the only thing that keeps us relevant, is expanding and reaching out, finding new ways to become relevant.
So the bottom line answer to your question is there a succession plan in place if something happened to Peggy or to me? And the answer is no, but we're working on it.
Yeah.
But the reality is there are a whole host of people that would keep things going if something were to happen before that, so it doesn't go away with Peggy and me. So that's we're comfortable right now that it's not going to wither on the vine and die, as it were.
And I have a second question too, I'm sorry. How do you collect the metrics for your website? So you just repeat that question.
What metrics do you? How do you collect them? Thank you. We're pretty standard. Google Analytics. We have some other tools. My company does hosting for some sites, boutique hosting really, and so we're doing that for Grand Bahama to mitigate cost. So we have some internal tools that do that as well. So that's really our tool base at this point. Because it's standard website interaction, it works. As we move into some of the more modern technologies, there'll have to be other tracking because you can't see what someone's doing necessarily if you pop something up and they're doing an AR experience, for example. That's a different set of tracking. But because we're fairly standard in that way, those are the tools that we use right now. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, sir.
I think the mic can reach, if you don't mind.
I'll reach the mic.
Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for the presentation. Arcelio Hartley, I'm from Panama. I'm involved in the support organization for the museum, West Indian Museum in Panama. This is obviously a private project, I think. How does it then become a public benefit? How does it get involved? How does it get into the schooling? How does it get support from the government side in the project that's going on?
Oh, this has been a philanthropic, private effort. I would say we're public. How do we move to work with museum monuments and antiquities, which would be our goal? There have been numerous attempts, to be honest with you all. I will continue to work that way. I was hoping once this was launched and we looked this good and we had this amount of content, that we could rest on our laurels there to see how good we were. That's the plan, is that we must interact. We must be recognized by them, work with them. You have something to say.
Yeah, I do. Peggy's learned I always have something to say. So to tie the last two questions together, really, the answer is the succession plan leads into your question, which is this. Yes, someday Peggy and Graham are not going to be here, but as Peggy mentioned, we are looking for a home. We'd love for a Grand Bahama organization to grow naturally, that we could turn the museum over to as a public entity. What we don't want to do is put it somewhere where it's going to be neglected. So that's a hard thing, right? First of all, it's our baby, but secondly, that's what happens in projects like this all too often. Okay, all too often is that, you go great guns, the people that were doing it need to move on for whatever reason, and it goes somewhere and it's just not the same level of care, enthusiasm, growth, or connection to the community. And so the best answer for us would be an organization in Grand Bahama or in the Bahamas that would, take it under its wing and it becomes part of what they're doing. We don't have that answer though, and like Peggy said, we've been trying to talk to people because that wouldn't be a short-term process either to get to that point. So no great answer to either of your questions, but that's something that we're very cognizant of and we know we need to solve.
Florida International University will take this in a snap, in a minute. But we hate to let it loose because I really feel that this belongs here in the Bahamas. There is the Digital Library of the Caribbean, which has also approached us through FIU, but again, it doesn't have it does not have the manner to interact with the content that we have here and engage and tell a story. The Digital Library of the Caribbean, we could easily transfer all our digitized images to them. They'd be thrilled to have it. But it doesn't tell our story, or it doesn't tell the story, not mine. It doesn't tell the story of the people of Grand Bahama or the Bahamas in the manner in which we do.
Yeah, and last night, for those of you that were there last night, which was awesome, I was sitting there listening to the panel thinking, hey, we're home. Oh, wow, we found our people. How do we know? Because of that very question. We don't want to take anything off Grand Bahama. We want Grand Bahama to own this and feel as part of their community, and you all talked about that last night. Perfect. That's what we talked about. Didn't know the right words to use about it, or that it was even a concept out there that people were struggling with. So our intent is to be on Grand Bahama or part of Grand Bahama or the Bahamas, but to stay home.
Another question, and as you clicked on Reverend Pinder's story, I noticed that it was transcribed, which means you have recorded his interview.
His voice.
Is that also then available on the DG? Is his voice still available? The recording the interview. Okay,
Yes.
but it's there.
Exactly what it
It's
is.
there. Okay, good.
If you listen to this one, it's all static, and you know what?
Tried our best.
Yeah, I saw that because I saw a home in there in the transcript. So,
Yep. Finally, right?
We are doing something along similar lines of what you're doing. We started a project called Our Stories, Our Museum. Can't tell you exactly when we've been. It got a little derailed by the pandemic, but maybe a couple of years before the pandemic. I'm going to guess 2015, 2016, Jamie? Yeah, right. So what we've discovered is that people are very interested in telling us what they want to see in the museum and on the digital platform. And we have a growing relationship where the community is taking more and more interest in the museum and ownership of the space. So my question is, to what extent have you been exploring that kind of back and forth with your community? Can they suggest stories that they want to see on your site? Do you reach out to them and ask them those kinds of questions? Is that a partnership that you're trying to evolve to maybe see if you can grow that,
So now you have to
that
repeat the question.
connection so that you do have someone to pass it on to?
So the question is how am I reaching out to the community to grow, or are they reaching out to me?
Yeah.
Yes, I've had a few persons offer. But the issue truly is that the population of Grand Bahama has decreased from 50,000 people, say at its peak perhaps, down to 30-ish right now, post-Dorian. So much has been lost. So many elders are gone that many of those stories that people have offered are second or third hand. So that's what we're finding, sadly. But yes, I'm reaching out. I'm asking the question. Anywhere I go, I tell my enthusiasm. I especially bring up, touch my picture, hear my story. Tell me your story. But also what I'm confronting is people are hesitant to speak to me, to share with me, because it's almost as if I'm taking something away. And I'm going, no, I'm not taking away. I'm trying to preserve. I'm trying to give it back. So I have found that hard. And also my Midwestern accent may have an issue with that. Well, then let's.
They have a similar issue. They're willing to talk, but then when you say let's record,
Yes.
they're very shy.
That's true. That is a problem. They're very shy. And And also, I've been invited into person's home. We have one interview, Nellie Seymour, who Graham has known for years and years. My father-in-law was a generation removed. Graham and his 4 brothers and sisters are adopted. So we've known Nellie for years and years. We went to her home, and we interviewed her. Unfortunately, we were not very knowledgeable at that time, and she had a fan. Oh, the first one, she had the TV on in the background. Well, we're so interested in what she had to say, we didn't realize that the TV in the background would interfere, of course, with our recording. Second time we went back, she's thrilled to see us. We love her. And the problem was she had a fan going. So we have learned that, as Mark said, professional photography, professional recording, but unfortunately the elders that are still on island are just not comfortable coming to you or able to come to, say, a recording studio. And that's why it was such a discovery to have David Wallace find those original recordings from years ago. But history is fragile, and we need to do it now.
Yeah, and from a implementation point of view, hurricanes and COVID really hurt us. And that was a decision we made to go forward because we had enough. Thank goodness we weren't starting during that time period. So that was another factor. And so, but social media is part of that answer as well, because for the younger people on up a couple generations, we can go out and find, and they're finding us, and that's a good way to do that.
Another thing that I've done, I reached out to professors at University of the Bahamas North Campus, English professors, even Ian Strawn, who was the president North Campus, and asked could they assign a writing project to students that would say, tell us a story. And these are the criteria: the historical nature, family lore, family stories. Tell us. But I wasn't able to, that wasn't an avenue that yielded any fruit, which I wish had, because the students have access to the grandparents or that other generation. But then again, I've had comments on Facebook that the old population wouldn't share. And then I'm tempted to write back, did you ask? But that's the issue here. Kids today, or the younger generation today, are so involved in that iPhone that
After this session, we have something that you might like to
So background to, we're trying to interact with them in the means that they reach them that way, with the idea that we want your stories, but yet we're not trying to take away, we're trying to share. And you share with us, we share with the world.
We can give a round of applause.